And welcome to our Be Aware Month. Thank you for joining us all this morning. I'm Karen Koss, Chief Executive of Apiculture New Zealand, and I'll be hosting our Be Aware Month event. For those of you who don't know Apiculture New Zealand, we are an industry good body who represents beekeepers, both commercial and hobbyists, as well as suppliers, marketers and the exporters. And every year in September, we hold this thing called Be Aware Month. And with the support of our members and with our bee lovers, it's really around organising and coordinating events and activities around Be Aware Month. And it's focused on supporting beekeepers and Kiwis to take actions to help our bees. So look, most people know that bees make honey and are essential pollinators. And we need our bees to keep our gardens, forests and horticultural and agricultural crops growing. Bees are sometimes called batteries of the natural world. And perhaps an not well-known fact is that we have over 880,000 hives in New Zealand. And if you work it out, they can hold up to about 60,000 bees. We have a lot of bees in New Zealand. So really our Be Aware Month is about making sure our bees are as healthy as possible so that they can stand up to some of the threats they face, things like pests, disease, climate change and habitat loss. And so that's why this year we're asking you all to feed the bees by planting trees. So usually we have an outside event to celebrate the start of the month. But this year, due to COVID, we've moved on the event online. And today I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Angus McPherson, who's an expert in planting for bees. And he's been involved in this for many years as a trustee for Trees for Bees Research Trust. So thank you very much, Angus, for joining us. So we've invited Angus here to answer your questions on planting for bees, and you're welcome to ask questions through the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can, but conscious we don't have a long time. The webinar is being recorded, and so we will make the video available to everyone through APNZ's and New Zealand Trees for Bees websites soon. Look, so first, just a very quick introduction about New Zealand Trees for Bees Trust and Angus. The Trust is a not-for-profit organisation. It's focused on keeping our pollinators happy and healthy. And Angus and fellow trustee botanist Dr. Linda Newstrom-Lloyd, who I understand is on the call today, research and produce resources, planning tools and guides to help farmers, gardeners and other groups plant in ways that maximise bee health and survival. So I'm going to ask Angus a few questions, and he's going to talk to us for a bit, and then we'll be open for your questions. So Angus, your background is in forestry. How did you get involved in the New Zealand Trees for Bees?
Good morning, Karen, and thanks for involving me in this webinar. I've been involved in farm work for more than the last decade, working with farmers and landowners on vegetation on farm for farm purposes and environmental purposes. So things like riparian planting, land stabilisation, water quality, paddock shade and shelter, amenity planting and biodiversity. And Trees for Bees fits really nicely within that. I guess it's another use for that type of vegetation, because what we do here is a little bit different in that we're not asking people to set aside land for bee forage. We're just saying, look at what you're already doing and how you can incorporate bee forage within that. So I got introduced to the program by East Coast beekeeper Barry Foster, and we were working on a farm up on the East Cape, and he introduced me to Linda. And actually the first property we worked on together was actually at Kintail Honey at Takapo.
Excellent. So look, why should we plant for bees? You know, what are some of the benefits?
Well, like you said in your introduction, the bees underpin our agricultural sector. I mean, something like 80% of our agriculture sector primary produce requires pollination, and the honeybees are our industrial scale pollinator. Globally, you've seen that there are a number of challenges facing bees with habitat loss and climate change, pesticide use and those sorts of things. There's been challenges in New Zealand with removal of weed species like willows on riverways and gorse, and weeds, bees love weeds, okay? And they love, willows are very important, gorse is actually very important, but they're losing some of that habitat. They're losing habitat because of intensification on farm and loss of biodiversity, and they're losing some floral diversity in our urban settings because of some of the breeding that's going on with flowers. So we need to support these pollinators. As you said, we now have over 800,000 hives in New Zealand. So it's been a massive increase in the last decade, and there hasn't been the same increase in floral resources outside of their honey and pollination seasons to support them. And so that's a big part of our work, is to identify those species that can help support all our pollinators year round.
Thank you. And so when you're planting for bees, what are the top tips you give bee lovers and gardeners?
Well, start from a point of what you're thinking of planting anyway, or where you might be planting, and look at those spaces in terms of what sort of planting is suited there, what other purposes it might have. On a farm, it might be a shelter belt, or it might be riparian planting. In somebody's garden, they might want hedging, or they might just want something for show, or it might be around the vegetable garden, for example. And if you start from that point, then you're working with something that you want and need anyway. And then it's a case then of looking at, well, what bee forage plants might be available that can fit within that framework. And think about the space you have available, any constraints that might place on the size of plants that you need, and also think about the amount of time and effort and budget you've got in terms of how many plants, and not necessarily trying to do it all at once. Think of a diversity of plants, and that can sometimes be more than one plant flowering at any one time, because like all natural organisms, bees do best on a diversity. But it can also be flowering over more than over a longer period of time. So you might have half a dozen different species that give you flowering from August through to November, and that's great because there's a continuity of flowering for that. But then, having said that, mass plantings are also good, because bees will look for they'll look for where they can get the biggest bang for their buck, as it were. And so if there's a mass planting, it's then and that might be, say, the edging around the garden, or that might be in a hedging or something like that. And I guess the other thing there is that there's usually plenty of things flowering in summer. So a lot of our effort is on that late winter, early spring, and then midsummer into autumn, those sort of shoulders of the season where there's often less flowering plants around, and we try and support those periods.
So what are some of the plants that you could recommend?
Well, look, I'm just going to share a screen with you. I've got some photos here of some quite gorgeous flowering plants. So I'll just check this is going to work. So hopefully you can see that there. There's a whole raft of plants that you can use. We've got a list on our website of something close to 400 different species. So people go and have a look at that under our information resources and the plant lists there. But particularly if you're constrained for space, then focus on a buzz plant. And I mean, what's a buzz plant? It's something that when you're some distance from it, you can still actually hear the bees. So we've got a 5-finger in our garden, which is probably about 20 or 30 meters from the house. And when I'm standing outside now, it's flowering at the moment, I can actually hear the bees on that 30 meters away. That's a real buzz plant. And why is it a buzz plant? Well, the bees have got easy access to that. You can see this in this camellia flower. It's a nice big bowl. The anthers are poking out, and you've got bees both scrabbling around for pollen around the outside, and that wee guy in the middle has got his head down and drinking nectar. It has a large amount of nectar or pollen depending on what the plant produces. It's got a lot of flowers per plant, and it has a high sugar content in the nectar. So that's what we call a buzz plant, and I'll just run through some examples here for you. The broader rose family, and this is not necessarily meaning ornamental roses here, but what we're talking about here are your blossom species. So your apples, your pears, your cherries, your plums, etc. Prolific spring flowers, and most of them are single flowers like this, this crab apple, and gives the bees easy access to that. So you know, that's something that if you've got an urban garden and you might be limited for space, you might still have room for a fruit tree, for example, or a blossom, you know, an ornamental blossom tree. Or you might be able to espalier it on a wall. You can get cultivars now where you can get more than one species on a, you know, 2 cuttings on a single plant, which gives you a bit more diversity. But they're a great one to use. There's some great, sorry, I haven't missed one, have I? No. There's some great native buzz plants. Cabbage trees are great, 5-finger, as I mentioned, flaxes, hoheria, our native lacebark, and there's 3 or 4 different species there that flower at different times of the year, from mid to late summer through to autumn. A lot of the hebes are good flowerers. Pittosporum, lemonwood's a great one. And ringaring is another really interesting one. Not so good if you've got a problem with slugs, but again, we've got that as a border on one of our paths, and in sort of November, December into January, it is just a mass of white flowers, and the bees absolutely love it. And your Parsonsia is the native jasmine. So again, if you're limited for space, but you might have a wall that you could grow something up, then that's an option there. We talk also about Super Bowl buzz plants, and that camellia I showed you earlier is one of those. And it has a big bowl, easy for the bees to land in and walk around and gather their pollen and nectar. So your peonies are an example, your magnolias are an example, as are your camellias. I made the comment before about simple flowers, and you've got to watch that with your camellias and some of your magnolias, some of your roses, some of your blossom species, where they're breeding the flowers for show, and they're very complex and intricate flowers, but they don't have ready access to the stamens or to the nectaries. So when you're looking at these species for feeding your pollinators, for your bees, you want to have the ones that have got a simple flower. Herbs are another brilliant one, particularly, you know, where you've got limited spaces. You can grow them in the pot, or you can grow them as a border, or you can have them in your vegetable garden. Most of your Mediterranean herbs have excellent nectar. And in these photos here, we've got thyme and rosemary and lavender, which are your staples. Oregano is brilliant, marjoram, dill. What else have we got there? Salvia and Phacelia are also all great flowers. So there's plenty of options there. And that's pretty an option for somebody who may not be so green-fingered but wants to plant something. Well, you know, herbs are something that are pretty easy to grow. And the other thing to think about is mixing your plants. So this is an example on the farm. This is actually at Kintail Honey. But what you can see on that left-hand photo there is that we've got, as part of a shelter belt, we've actually got a hedge of Michaelia yenonensis going through there, and that's great flowering late winter, early spring. But that can work as a single plant in a garden. It can work as a hedge in a garden. And on that right-hand photo there, we've got the Mana ash. Now, it's a tree, but it's not a big tree. It grows to maybe 8 meters or so. So again, that might fit in an urban garden. Wonderful spring flower, smothered in flowers. And what they've done there is they've underplanted that with lavender. So you can think about what you can plant above and what you can plant below when you're looking at these things. And as I mentioned earlier, we're often looking at autumn flowering as an area where there can be a gap. So that's where your camellias, your lavenders, herbs like your oregano, the Michaelia is good, Phacelia, etc. They're great autumn flowering species. So I'll stop that share. But hopefully that gives you some ideas of some of the things that you can look at. But as I said, have a look online on the Trees for Bees website. We've got planting guides there, and we've got plant lists there. We've got sections for what we call our star performer plants, which are some of our very best. So go and have a look and see what works for you.
Thank you so much, Angus. Lots of great tips there, and I like the fact that it's for the large gardens, the farms, and the small gardens. So thank you, and some great imagery. Look, I'm just going to launch a poll, everybody, just to find out what kind of planting advice you're looking for. So just let us know if you're wanting to plant for trees in the urban setting, the suburban or rural properties. And we'll get onto the questions. Just a reminder, we had asked people at the start if they could use the Q&A function. I'll try and cover both the Q&A and the chat because there's some great questions coming through, but I'll start with the Q&A first. Okay, so is there a list, Angus, of sources, nurseries where trees can be obtained?
We don't have a list online at the moment. It's something that's on our to-do list. We are working with nurseries, but it depends a little bit as to what you want and how much you want. A lot of nurseries now are starting to identify bee-friendly plants, and if you're just wanting a smaller number of plants, then your local garden shop or nursery will be able to help. If you're looking for larger quantities, then there are sort of more wholesaler type nurseries around. Appleton's and Nelson is one. Southern Woods just out of Christchurch is another. Midlands and Napier's another. So there's options there. The photograph at Kintail of those Mana ash, they were planted as quite a large grade tree. So there are places that specialise in large trees if you want an immediate impact. And so I think we got those from Leaflands. Easy Big Trees in Invercargill was another one that we've done some work with. So there are plenty of sources out there for a range of plants for you.
I guess the other thing too, and one of the questions is, what is your website, Angus, so they can actually go online and have a look at the trees and plants themselves?
Yeah. treesforbeesnz.org is our website, and it's it was on that last slide too, so if people can have a look at that.
Someone is working with the local council and keeps bees in the Queenstown Botanical Gardens. Lucky thing. We're looking to plant out a bee-friendly zone area with educational signage. We would love some advice on a perennial seed mix that may be suitable for this purpose.
The perennial, well, things like Phacelia is great there. I mean, if you did a mix with Phacelia and buckwheat, salvia, borage, but you pretty have to watch how quickly the borage spreads. Those are all good perennials and self-seeders that would meet that need. Okay. Most of those are autumn flowers, although if they're self-seeding and reseeding, you might find they'll flower more than once a year.
So another question, do you have any recommendations for an ECE centre on suitable types of plants or flowers for all seasons?
For all seasons? Sorry, for ECE, so early childhood centre.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, you probably want to have things that the kids, well, you've got a mixture there. I mean, you'd use herbs, because that's something that they can use in other things. You can use them for cooking, and they can help with the planting and that. If you wanted to have hedging around there, then you've got things like, you've got native species like the Olearia paniculata, I think that's Akiraho is its name, that flowers in autumn. The Michaelia we showed you earlier, that's late winter, early spring. What else has got? You might want some shade. So depends how big a tree you want or need to get, but I mean, oaks are an interesting one. It probably take a little bit too long to grow, but they're a great source of pollen. Blossom trees would be great, because you get, again, spring blossom and autumn color. But again, look, have a look on our website, because we do have rough indications of flowering times, and probably take a little step back and say, what sort of plants do we want that fit in with the early childhood centre? How much there do we want? Do we need hedging? Well, then there are some hedging options like your Olerias or your red Matapo or camellias or Michaelias all make good hedging, and they are all good flowering plants. Where you might have a garden, use herbs as part of that. Having fruit trees, I'd say, would be a brilliant asset, because then you can talk about food production, but then you can also, that's something that they can collect and watch the seasons and those sorts of things themselves.
A question here, which is quite an interesting one, a good one. On the list, can you identify which plants are not livestock friendly?
There are, yeah, that can be quite a complex one, but there's things like, well, there's obviously things like tutu, but that's not something that anybody's going to plant. Rhododendrons are something that you have to watch around livestock. But what we say to people there is to check with your, usually with your regional council or your district council, in terms of what plants they might have there. But there's also a couple of national registers on that. We've tended to focus on plants that are good for bee forage, and that's part of our screening. We're not going to be promoting anything that's going to have some toxicity issues, but it's such a big complex area in its own right, that that's a hard one to balance, to be able to cover all those things off.
Another question here, Angus, can you explain a bee forage budget, please?
So a bee forage budget is, because I saw a question on the chat there about, is the number of plants flowering, does that determine the number of bees? And the point there is that the number of bees in a hive changes over the year. So you have the hive has its, or the colony has its smallest number of bees over winter. And that's the quiet time of year for them. In a colder climate, they'll just stay in their hive for the winter. In a warmer climate, they might go out occasionally, but they're there to just rest up over the winter and get ready for the coming season. And so there might only be 10,000 bees in a colony over winter. And that colony grows rapidly in size during late winter, early spring, up until beginning of summer, when it starts doing its pollination and its honey gathering work. And that might grow up to 60,000 bees in a hive or in a colony. And so what we need to do there is we need to balance the availability of forage to allow those bee numbers to build up. So how we do that is we look at the number of species and the number of plants available, and have that increasing during that period, so that the hive can build up to its full productive size, so that when it starts pollination or it starts the honey work, it's ready for that. If it's not ready for it, then if it's on honey, then that first bit of honey is actually going to go back to help the hive build up, and the beekeeper's not going to be able to harvest that. Or if it's on pollination, it's not going to be at its strongest ability to be able to do that. We then drop back the number of plants that are flowering during the pollination and honey seasons, because they're then focusing on what it is that they're pollinating or collecting honey from. And that goes through to sort of middle-ish of summer. And then after that, the honey is taken off the hive, and the bees then need to, I guess, replace some of that, and so that they've got their stores available for them to go through the winter. And so that's where late summer into autumn's important, because that covers your I guess your autumn recovery period and setting up for overwintering, because overwintering, the bees have to live for a longer period of time. So you want strong, healthy bees and a much smaller number of them going into winter, so that then you have a strong colony for the following year. So that's so the budget is balancing the availability of appropriate flowering plants to match the life cycle of that bee colony. And again, it's explained in some of our publications with some quite nice charts there, which show the change in bee numbers over the season, over the year, and what they're doing at those various seasons, and how you balance the plant numbers against that.
Thank you. There's a question from someone who has an orchard of 20 to 30 fruit trees in coastal Otago, and what underplantings should they use?
Work backwards from that in terms of, with that orchard, when are those trees coming into flower? And then you would be looking at plants that flower up to that point in time and then stop flowering, so that as the bee numbers build, or there's a little bit of an overlap between the two, so that's starting to stop flowering, while when your orchard species are then coming into flower, so that the bees then make a transition from that earlier forage onto your fruit trees. So, and fruit trees can be flowering anytime from September, October onwards. So if you were looking at late winter to early spring, if you had a need for or had some space for some hedging or some shelter around that, then that's where something like a camellia hedge or a Michaelia, that Michaelia yenenensis hedge would be really good. That covers that period. You can use willows for that period in time. If there are willows that are available that will flower from July through to November, so you could pick an early season one, and some of those are shrub willows that don't get too big, so you can hedge them. So what else would we have? You could use, there'll be herb species that you could use. You might be able to get a lavender. Would you get a lavender flowering in? Possibly a bit too soon for that. But if you're wanting to plant something underneath, then you might use canola. If you plant that the previous autumn, then it should be flowering for you early spring. If clover is flowering before your orchard species goes in, then that's another option. If there's too much of an overlap, then run your lawnmower over the top and take the flowers off the top of it. So there's a range of options there for you.
We've got quite a few more questions that hopefully we can get through, Angus. So
sure.
A question around local or regional funds. Are there any local or regional funds to apply for funding to support trees?
Yeah. Yes, there are. Most of them will be focused on well, there's environmental funds, there are funds for fencing off and planting waterways, those sorts of things. There used to be money available through the Billion Trees Fund, but that's largely over allocated now. there are programs like Trees That Count, that if you've got an initiative that you want to put in, you can put forward a proposal for a project and request funding for that. But again, look, talk to your local council, because it varies greatly depending on what it is that you're trying to do. But if it's got a you know, an environmental slant to it, there's usually some degree of money available.
Okay, someone here has trouble with ants. What could we plant close to hives to inhibit them? How small and how many trees?
To inhibit ants?
Yes.
Oh, that's a gnarly one.
We could come back to that one, Angus.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I could answer what plants inhibit ants. It's not something that we've had to deal with. Leave them. I mean, you know, you might. I mean, what plant does permethrin come from? That's because that's a naturally based insecticide or deterrent. So Google that, and that's probably as much help as I can give you there.
Can you please list some of the flowering plants that are actually toxic to the bees and honey production?
There are, I mean, the main ones that we get, the name's going to escape me now. There is a native plant that is great for birds, but it produces, but it's actually toxic to bees. I'd have to think about that. Rhododendrons aren't good for bees, but having said that, I've got rhododendrons in my garden and I've never ever seen a honeybee on one, whereas bumblebees love them. So that's probably one of those things that if you've got enough other things that are flowering at a similar time that the honeybees love, then you shouldn't have an issue with that. Tutu is something to be wary of. I mean, that's more for a farming thing, because the bees actually find that really good for building up in spring, but where that becomes an issue is that if they have the sapsucker on them and it produces a honeydew in autumn, that will actually taint the honey. And it's the bees are okay on it, but it's anybody who eats the honey is not good for them. What else have we got?
Look, I think that's
Coolfly. Well, coolfly is an interesting one because people ask about that, and bees love it, right? But they'll drink too much of it, and then they'll fall off and fall asleep. And if they don't wake up in time to get home for the end of the day, they won't. So you've got to be a little bit careful with that. There are some species of linden, the European lime tree, which are toxic. We've got lime trees on our list, the Platyphilus and cordata, the common one, and there aren't issues with that, but there is a particular species of that. But again, I guess where we focus is on the list of stuff that doesn't have an issue, and that's what we include in our plant list. So if you work off our plant lists, you'll be pretty good.
Okay, just another couple of questions before we finish up. Are Federation daisies helpful for bees?
Federation daisies. Yeah. Sorry, can they give me a? Should I Google the?
While you're, someone can Google that. How many hectares per hive should we plant to maintain a healthy hive?
That's a perennial question. How that typically works for a lot of the beekeepers is that they know their, they know their area, and they know through experience over time how many hives they can go in an area. It's become more challenging as we've had more hives because there's more pressure on them. Bees will comfortably browse 3 to 5 kilometres from their hive. They've been recorded up to, I think, 14 or 15 kilometres, so they cover quite a range. we work, I mean, people have asked us that question, you know, to do with manuka plantations. And the thing that, where we got to with that was, you're not going to be able to plant every single hectare in your manuka plantation for that. So work off 10 or 20% of that as being unplantable in manuka and fill that with bee forage. We sort of advise people to plant as much as you possibly can. We do have people asking us the questions of how many plants per hive. And it's a difficult one to answer without, I mean, you're either going that through a trial or error, or we're going through the process of how many grams of pollen per anther on a flower, how many anthers per flower, how many flowers per plant. And that's, you know, outside of the scope of what we're doing. So I would suggest that you plant as much as you can in and around your apiary site. And if you're working on a larger property, then as you're doing other planting on that property, then look at how you can incorporate bee forage into that.
Thank you. A couple more questions. What is the best way to encourage bumblebees and native bees into urban gardens?
Plentiful planting. You know, it's, I mean, we've seen native bees on exotic plants, and we see honeybees on native plants. So it doesn't necessarily have to be natives. A lot of our native bees are solitaries, and they're only emerging at certain times of the year. It would pay to check with, and DOC or your regional council might be able to help there in terms of what particular native bees that you have in your area and what their emergence times are, because typically they'll emerge, they'll do their pollen and nectar collection, and they'll lay their eggs, and that's it. And a lot of that's actually during summer. So plenty of summer flowering native species should cover that for a lot of your native pollinators. Bumbles love, well, they love their rhododendrons, they love their herb gardens, they love clover. You know, there are a lot of different plants that they'll go on as well. And I think if you're looking at flowers that only they will go to, then you tend to go to your more tubular flowers because they've got a longer tongue. So things like your tree lucerne, your pea species, those sorts of things are particularly good for bumbles.
Thank you. So probably just one more question, I think, because we are well over time, and we do have to finish up at some stage. Willows are a problem as they are very weedy on conservation land. What native species of plant would provide the same food source at the same time of year if we were to remove those willows?
Well, that's a massive question, because willows are prolific producers of high quality pollen and nectar. And it is an issue. We've done quite a lot of work on willows because they are so important. And one of the solutions to that also, though, is using willows that aren't weedy. So that's your crack willow and your grey willow, but also careful in terms of how you site them so they're not too close to watercourses, so that they don't clog watercourses and don't spread via them. But if you're looking at late winter, early spring, then your five-finger is a great species for that. And then through your spring build-up period, you'll have some of the pittosporum species are very good. Olearia species are a great source of pollen, but not of nectar. What else have we got? Cabbage trees are a bit later, flaxes are a bit later. So it's that sort of August, September, October period, and that's probably where your pittosporums would be one of the key ones that would work during that period. Five-finger, but if you've got five-finger, you've got to have very, very good pest control, because they are a favourite of possums.
Thank you very much, Angus. There were a few more. I'm sorry, and they kept coming, and they will probably keep coming. I really appreciate. Well, I think we all do appreciate your time today. I know that you're
very welcome.
In demand for other discussions around Be Aware Month. So thank you. And to our listeners and our watchers, I hope you found the webinar interesting. As we said, we have recorded it, and so it will be available through APNZ's website and through the Trees for Bees Research Trust website, and encourage you to join our respective Facebooks as well, so you can keep up to date with what is going on. As I said, we will share this video and through our website and through our Be Aware Month social media. I hope you've learned enough to go out and plant a few things. I certainly have. I'll be looking at the garden on the weekend again, Angus. So everyone, thank you, and have a great Be Aware Month.
Thanks very much, Karen. That was an absolute pleasure.